on. I just knocked over my camera. I'm picking it on. Sorry about that.
So, as some of you probably know, RL Stine month is off to quite a rocky start, but don't fear, we are continuing on by reading the incredibly popular, totally widely talked about Goosebumps book, Why I'm Afraid of Bees. And I know what you're thinking, Lula, why? Well, you see, I've always been really into horror, and R.L. Stine is, you know, the king of children's horror, so that really fueled that interest for me growing up. I often read his books and was not even really fazed by them, and actually enjoyed the super detailed cover art, which is an opinion I still stand by. However, one Goosebumps book that I've never read is Why I'm Afraid of Bees, or I've obviously read it now. I came across this book on like multiple occasions, but out of all the book covers, this one scared me so bad. Like, it scared me the most, so I just kind of avoided it at all costs. In hindsight, the cover is just like a little unsettling if anything, and most of you can probably agree that there are like way more terrifying Goosebumps book covers. I just think bees especially freaked me out when I was like a lot younger. And this is actually because I got stinged when I was like 6. And so to this day, if I see a bee, I do get a little on edge, you know? Even though I know they won't hurt me, I've like matured enough. It does freak me out. I don't want that to happen again. I've actually stepped on bees on 2 occasions too, and that is not fun. So in total, I've been stung like 3 times. I don't want to deal with that. Anyway, since this channel is all about healing my inner child, I thought it was time I face my fears once and for all and finally read this book. Actually, the real origin of this video idea was I was at Goodwill anyway, looking for the Junie B. Jones books in like the little book section they have. And that's when I saw another Goosebumps book and I was like reminded. I was like, oh, like imagine if they had that Why I'm Afraid of Bees book and then I could read it for Halloween. That would be kind of a funny video, wouldn't it? And I kid you not even 2 seconds later, well, it was probably more like 2 minutes, I found it. And if you ask me, that was definitely a sign from the universe. So here we are, I did in fact buy the book. Now, what exactly is this story about? Well, let's read the synopsis on the back of the book, shall we? Gary Lutz needs a vacation from himself. Bullies are constantly beating him up. His only friend is his computer. Even his little sister doesn't like him. But now Gary's dream is about to come true. He's going to exchange bodies with another kid for a whole week. Gary can't wait to get a new body until something horrible happens. And Gary finds out his new body isn't exactly human. This pretty much explains our unsettling book cover, which shows a bee with a human boy's head, or as the book describes, right brain, wrong body. Now, 2 things before we start. 1, I feel like this video is gonna have a lack of like a B-roll. Usually when I read books and like cover them for videos, I download a PDF and I insert photos and stuff, but since there's no pictures in this book, I found that to be very, I don't know, unnecessary. Just know I'm quoting things. Maybe I'll put up like a silly picture. I don't know what I'm gonna do yet. Most of the time in this video I do this, it should be pretty obvious, but I just wanted to make a disclaimer. And number 2, let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Aura, and I honestly couldn't think of a better time to be talking about them because did you guys hear about how hackers may have stolen the social security numbers of every American? Over 2.9 billion records were stolen from National Public Data, which offers personal information to employers, private investigators, staffing agencies, and others doing background checks. These stolen records can include a person's full name, address, date of birth, social security number, and phone number, along with alternate names and birth date. Point being, if you weren't taking precautions with your personal information online before, this should be a huge wake-up call. We've truly never been more vulnerable online than right now. I know firsthand how scary it can be to like have your information compromised, because last tax season when I was a first-time tax filer, I actually had an identity theft scare. When my accountant went to file my taxes, he couldn't because it said they'd already been filed. So I was contacted by him and I was like, well, I didn't file them. So I ended up having to call the IRS, and to this day, we still don't know exactly how or why this happened. Thankfully though, everything did turn out okay, but it was still a stressful experience I never want to go through again. It's really not fun to have an incident like this and not really understand why it even happened to begin with. That's why I'm not taking any chances now, and I will be using Aura to keep myself protected. Aura basically will alert me if they find my phone number, email, social security number, on the dark web. Let's say someone tries to use this information to access my credit or bank accounts. They'll give me up to $5 million in identity theft insurance should the worst case scenario happen. This is only the tip of the iceberg too. Aura also provides a bunch of other features to keep you safe online, conveniently all inside one app. So if you're interested in trying out Aura for yourself, you can go use my link, which will be in the description, aura.com/lulaloopsey, to try 14 days for free, which is more than enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data was exposed. Again, I cannot think of a better time than now to try Aura for yourselves, because not only is national public data not going to do anything to help you, but they probably aren't even going to face any repercussions for this leak. I know I saw a tweet about this a while ago and it was really alarming information to read. I was like, is this even real? And especially after my tax scare, I just realized how important it is to be proactive about protecting your identity. So I'm doing what I can to not leave myself and my family vulnerable to data breaches. Thank you so much again to Aura for sponsoring today's video. Again, you can use my link, it'll be in the description, to try Aura out for yourself today. Anyway, let's get back to why I'm afraid of bees. Going into this book, I expected to probably find it comical. I didn't read the plot beforehand, I just picked up the book and began reading. Okay, I promise I'm done. I'm not gonna do this the whole video. But point is, saying I was shocked was a bit of an understatement. Not really because of the story at hand, like the bee aspect, I guess.
Well, maybe partly that.
But mostly because the fact our main character, this kid, he can't get a break. And so early on, it's like actually heartbreaking that I almost, maybe it was a mix of sleep deprivation, but I almost started crying. Basically, our story starts by introducing us to our main character, 12-year-old Gary Lutz, who claims his life is in the pits. As we kind of took note of from just reading the back of the book, he's a victim of some pretty extreme bullying, and even his younger sister doesn't seem to like him. The family dynamics in this book made me so sad for this kid. It's just like defeat after defeat, no matter like how hard he tries to escape things. Before we even get to that, not even 2 pages into this book, we get this like gut-wrenching quote from Gary regarding the things he's experienced. Why is that? I constantly ask myself. What exactly is wrong with me? Why do all the kids call me names like Lutz the Klutz? Why does everyone always make fun of me? Sometimes I think it might be because of the way I look. That morning, I'd spent a long time studying myself in the mirror. I'd stared at myself for at least a half an hour. I saw a long, skinny face, a medium-sized nose, and straight blonde hair. Not exactly handsome, but not terrible. Now, personally, I haven't endured like any extreme life-altering bullying like Gary has. Like, he literally gets beat up several times in this book. But I've been excluded and tricked into thinking people were my friends growing up. This specifically had to do with the fact that I'm autistic, and when I was younger, social cues were way harder for me to read. It's like something I felt the need to study over time and master to not fall victim to that kind of thing, if that makes sense. Which is really sad to actually say out loud. I remember in 3rd grade being in this like trio where they'd go hang out without me at recess and promise me it'd be my day to hang out the next day, then belittle me and act like they never said that. But my point is, I wasn't beaten up, but I do relate to the way Gary talks about wondering what was wrong with him in this quote. And I think this can be explained by the fact that I really relate to the growing up undiagnosed experience, although I'm actually very fortunate that I had a very early diagnosis. But the thing is, nobody ever told me I was autistic. Like, it was something I dead-ass figured out myself, reading my own IEP paperwork at like 13, 14 years old. So for a long time, I just thought I had a learning disorder and continued to be in denial about the fact that I was autistic for even years after this point when I read that paperwork, just out of insecurity. So that feeling of like always knowing I was different but not exactly being able to put a label on it for a long time made me also wonder the same things Gary is. Like, why am I like this? Why can't I just fit in with everybody else? Experiencing getting excluded or just being self-aware that you are different is truly enough to make you become overly critical of yourself, because surely I must be the problem. And I think that's why to this day I still struggle so much with like anxiety and like being perceived, which is ironic to say because I want to make this my job. I think it's more like the IRL aspect, because like when you're filming and sitting in front of a camera, there's no one watching you.
I'm home alone right now.
But yeah, experiences like the one I just mentioned from a young age, like seriously fuck you up and make you have trust issues later down the line. I know that's how it is for me. But wow, okay, vulnerability tangent, whoa. Where the bees come in, let's talk about that. Gary's neighbor is actually a beekeeper. And so even though Gary is afraid of bees, sometimes he'd watch him from a distance while he was in his beekeeping suit, just cause I don't know, he was curious. He's literally a kid, but even his neighbor is not fond of him. I mean, staring is rude, I guess. I do understand that. I won't deny that. But from Gary's perspective, in this book, he's not disrupting his work or anything. He's not even talking to him. He's just simply watching him from his backyard, like through the fence. I assume through like a crack in the fence. So to me, this just sounds like really a non-issue, and like this guy is just kind of purposely mean to him for no reason. And by the way, what I mean by not fond of him or like being mean to him is like Mr. Andretti, that's the neighbor's name. On this day in particular, he got the bees to like cover him all over his suit so that it was like completely black. And then he acknowledged Gary, who was watching him through the fence in his backyard, by saying, "Gary, look out! The bees! They're out of control! Run!" I never ran so fast in my life. I charged across the yard and stumbled up the back steps of my house. I flung open the screen door and almost fell into the house. Then I stopped and leaned against the kitchen table, gasping for air. When I finally caught my breath, I listened hard. I could hear the angry buzzing of the bees from the next yard. Then I heard something else. Ha ha ha! Somebody was laughing out there, and it sounded suspiciously like Mr. Andretti. Slowly, I turned around and peered through the screen door. My neighbor was standing at the bottom of the steps, and I could see he had a huge grin on his face. Like, dude, what are you getting out of scaring a 12-year-old who admits the only reason he's watching is because even though he's scared of bees, he's actually fascinated by them still. And speaking of being afraid of things, frankly, he's afraid of a lot. Like dogs, big mean kids, the dark, loud noises, swimming in the ocean, and even his little sister's cat, Claus. And this is coming from someone who, I never want to have kids. I don't like being around children. It stresses me out. But I will never understand how like people say the most like violent things towards children, especially online. I see it a lot lately. Or they're purposely like mean to them and belittle them and treat them like a child. And I mean, obviously they should be treated like a child and perceived as one, they are. But like sometimes they're treated as if they're like a little kid when he's like 12. And even brings up how this neighbor, like, I think he says that he's like 10, but he knows damn well that Gary is 12. But enough about the neighbor. Later we get a feel for Gary's dynamics with his peers as well, as he wanders to the park because, in his words, he feels lonely. And when he arrives, he quickly takes notice of a group that's about to start playing softball. Unfortunately, no one wants him on their team, and he has to witness them arguing over who's gonna be stuck with him. They finally settle, the game goes on, and eventually after getting a bunch of strikes and the kids laughing and calling him "Let's the klutz," he just walks away without saying anything. But this day doesn't end here for Gary, okay? He gets back to his street and runs into 3 of his biggest bullies, who are named Barry, Marv, and Carl. They are the same age as Gary, but just like 5 times bigger than him, and they end up beating up Gary despite him pleading to please give him a break because he was having, and I quote, a bad day. After this interaction, Gary gets home and quickly goes to the bathroom to get cleaned up, so that way his mom like wouldn't notice what happened, because Gary kind of became afraid that if his parents like tried to interfere with this in any way, the boys would just take it out on Gary even worse than they already were. They were already beating him up, so that's a scary thought. But after he got cleaned up and changed, he went downstairs to find his sister and his mom baking, and the torment only continued from here. So basically they asked him to help out by opening a new jar of peanut butter as their recipe called for it. So Gary did as he was told. He got the jar of peanut butter, but he tried and tried and tried, and the lid of the peanut butter simply wouldn't budge. So ultimately his sister ended up getting kind of fed up with this and came over and opened the peanut butter jar herself, and it took her exactly 1 try, which caused this like chain reaction of her and her mom just laughing at Gary, losing their minds over this. "I guess you forgot to eat your oat bran this morning," said Mom. "I'm leaving," I muttered to Mom and Chrissy, "forever." The 2 of them were laughing together. I don't even think they heard me. Then, when you think it absolutely could not get worse, trust me, it does. Gary tells us about his new bike, which he got for his 12th birthday. Gary loves this bike. He thinks it is so cool, and so as an escape from this awful day, he decides that he's gonna take a ride around the neighborhood. And as soon as he turns down the street, he ends up seeing two girls walking on the sidewalk, who he immediately recognized as popular girls from his school and wanted to impress them. Gary shares that he's had a major crush on one of them who's named Judy since the 4th grade. And from what he tells us, it doesn't seem like either of them have outright been mean to Gary. Like, maybe they think he's weird, but he doesn't even imply they think that. He just implies that they simply don't know each other. So he flipped his baseball cap around so the brim was at the back of his head and folded his arms across his chest and started pedaling with no hands. Then quickly as he passed them, he flashed his most glamorous smile at the girls. But that smile would quickly fade when he realized his shoelace got stuck in the chain of his bike. A horrible grinding sound filled the air. The bike jerked and lurched from side to side. I lost control. "Gary!" I heard Judy shriek. "Gary, look out for that car!" When reading this part of the book, I was optimistic actually that they would care about his safety despite not being friends, especially because they do see him like topple off his bike into a lamppost, landing face first into some mud. But this is the interaction that happens after the fact. I heard the car rumble past me slowly. I pulled my face out from the mud. Guess I didn't look too cool. I thought bitterly, maybe at least I'll get a little sympathy. No way. I could hear Judy and Caitlin laughing behind me on the sidewalk. "Nice bike, Gary," one of them called as they hurried away. I had never been so humiliated in all my life. So yeah, see what I mean? This kid never gets a break. Like, what the hell? He doesn't even try to hide his injuries this time either. I mean, what will his mom do anyway? Laugh at him again? That's what he can only assume. After cleaning up for the second time that day, he ends up in his room and he decides to boot up his computer. Gary finds the computer as a form of an escape from things because nobody calls him Let's the Klutz on there. It's here that the switching bodies element comes in. Basically, there's a specific game called Planet Monster Fantasy, which he's been stuck on, I believe, like a certain level or a certain challenge in the game for the past 2 days. So before opening up the game, he decides to check on his computer note, which is one of those like electronic bulletin board like websites. It's essentially a forum. This is way earlier internet, but unfortunately the first thought that popped in my head was the Moshi Monsters bulletin board. And someone does. Someone tells him to try stabbing the dragon between the eyes, which to him is helpful advice, but he never ends up beating this level or challenge in the game, like within the course of this book. In fact, he ends up dying like 23 times in the process when he goes to play this game later that night. So like, I can't tell if someone put this up there to kind of like mock him and trick him into just like dying over and over again. But that's not important, okay? What I want to focus on is another message he sees underneath this, which piques his interest. It's not really a message, it's like an ad of sorts. It reads, "Take a vacation from yourself. Change places with someone for a week." This immediately intrigues Gary because he is obviously so unhappy with his current life. So the next day after school, he goes to the building and he describes it as a small gray building, like I assume kind of like a cubicle. He goes up some stairs and then into this like small beige waiting room, and it's here that he meets this dark-haired woman sat behind a big glass window. Her name is Miss Carmen. Obviously she's behind this glass, but like her voice, it's not just like behind the glass, like she is talking into a microphone which is projecting in this through this speaker. So it's really trippy to hear, you know? And when Gary witnesses this, it kind of freaks him out. She explains it has to do with the equipment being delicate, and she has to stay behind the glass for that reason. And when Gary peers over the woman's shoulder, he sees a full wall of electronic equipment, including heart monitors, video screens, x-ray machines, and cameras. Gary compares this to something straight out of Star Trek, but this whole concept is really reminding me of a Black Mirror episode. Ultimately, Gary chickens out, but decides to still have his picture taken for their catalog and fill out this like questionnaire of sorts to learn more about him. This is so they can learn obviously about Gary as a person, but this in return will help with the pairing process to pair him with another kid so they can switch places. Now all that was really left to do was wait for a call back, and so that's what Gary did. But Gary becomes very fixated very quickly on getting this call back because on his way home from the person-to-person office, he gets beaten up again by the same 3 bullies, and understandably this makes him regret just not going through it like with the body switch that very same day. So he really starts to look forward to getting away from his life as Gary Lutz more than ever. The process does take a few days, but eventually, at what would be pretty much perfect timing, he gets a call back and immediately agrees to undergo the switching process. So Miss Carmen heads over to his house. His parents are out and his sister is at her friend's house, which leaves Gary with the house all to himself. So, that really worked out. Let's go in the kitchen, Miss Carmen suggested. I like to set up my equipment on a table. She opened a small case and took out some black boxes with monitors on them. I showed her the way to the kitchen. So, who's this kid who wants to switch places with me, I asked. His name is Dirk Davis. Now, Dirk Davis was a fit and athletic kid his age, but his interest in switching bodies with Gary wasn't really for his body, but his mind. See, Dirk was doing really terribly in math, or wasn't good at math, and so he thought that Gary in his body could help him out with the problem. Specifically, he had some hard math test coming up in summer school, and Gary admits himself, he usually does pretty good on his math tests, but Miss Carmen informs him that she already knows that, because person to person does their homework. This could just be alluding to more of a background check behind the scenes when pairing Gary and Dirk, or that the questionnaire could have just helped her come to that conclusion, because we don't know all of the questions that were on the questionnaire. Gary at this point is excited. This situation does sound ideal, but unfortunately for Gary, his part of the body switch would go seriously, completely wrong in a way that's never happened before with person to person. We know of his beekeeper neighbor. Well, right before getting the call from person to person, some bees were following Gary around, and from his laughter, it's implied that Andretti did this on purpose to mess with him for watching him again in the backyard. However, the door was left slightly open, so the bees started to follow him into his house, and I guess somehow one got into the machine or interfered with the equipment that Miss Carmen brought, because next thing we know, Gary wakes up in a bee's body while Dirk gets to be in Gary's body and the bee gets to be in Dirk's body. When I tell you this has to be one of the funniest Goosebumps books I've ever read, this is no diss to RL Stine. I love his work, but I don't know if it's the situation or the way this kid talks, but it reads like a fan fiction, or maybe all Goosebumps books just have more of a comedy aspect to them than I remember, because to be fair, this is the first one I'm reading in a decade, and it's definitely got me interested in reading more of them. I can't lie.
This was an entertaining read. It definitely hooked me.
Anyway, if you thought Gary's life in his human body was hard enough, well, think again, because he dodges various death experiences throughout his time spent as a bee. And this is something that starts almost immediately. Within the first hour of being a bee, he follows Miss Carmen to her car to try to get her attention that something went seriously wrong. Of course, she can't hear him because, well, he's a fucking bee. Gary thinks, let me go up to her ear and she'll hear me then. But all this does is startle her, causing her to swat him away, and he lands on the pavement. And then her car tire almost runs him over as he's kind of stuck, it's if you fell and you're kind of just ow, you're on the ground still, processing the pain. So yeah, he's just kind of stuck there. He's seeing this tire. He's trying to muster up the energy to fly away. But luckily, Miss Carmen stops the car to put her seatbelt on, because I guess she forgot. So Gary, that left him just enough time to regain his energy and strength and fly away. His other near-death experience within the first hour is when he's trying to follow his dad and Gary, aka Dirk, and they're talking about dinner, and he was like, oh, let's get dinner started. And I think they were going outside, but anyway, they open this screen door, and he wants to follow them, of course, but he just barely misses being shut in this screen door. After reflecting on what had just happened and realizing, he still lets the klutz even as a bee, he has a third near-death experience, this time with Claus the cat. I flapped my wings and started to take off in the air, but I'd only risen about an inch off the ground when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was Claus the cat. With his long, sharp claws extended, he leaped through the air. I let out a squeal as he pounced on me. He grabbed me in one paw and began to tighten his claws around my body. Luckily, Gary was able to escape just in time, during this encounter, so truly he must be doing something right. right? Even though this is like such a small victory, I mean, he's a bee, he feels so oddly accomplished because of this, and weirdly it gives him this like burst of self-confidence that he didn't have before, despite obviously this being such an unusual situation to be into, or that he had gotten himself into. However, it doesn't last long before his beekeeper neighbor decides to ruin this moment too, only this time unknowingly, by catching Gary in his net, just like he would with any other bee. This was a pretty interesting experience if you really think about it, because Gary did say his neighbor's bees fascinated him, no matter how scared he was of them. And so he gets to see firsthand what it's like in a beehive and what they actually do in there. But understandably, he describes it as a crawling, buzzing nightmare. He was basically the only bee really standing around doing nothing until he had to kind of cave and feast on some honey from the honeycombs, or else, I don't know, he'd starve. He knew he needed to eat something if he ever wanted any sort of chance at getting his old life back, or to get out of the hive in general. Another thing that's so interesting is he can't really interact with the other bees. Like, they all have jobs and they all can communicate, but Gary can still speak like words while the bees just buzz. So yeah, this isn't like the Bee Movie or something, okay? This shit is real life. Let me just read some of his narration for this part, because I can only really like explain so much. I can't do it justice. The way this kid tells this story is just so fucking funny. "Please, leave me alone," I begged in my tiny voice. "Please give me a break." The bee glared back at me. I'd never seen such a big, angry-looking bee. Slowly, I started backing away from him. I squeaked nervously. "I've gotta get going now. I have to get back to work." The bee bulged his eyes and waved his antennas in a threatening way. I was sure he planned to sting me. I turned away and flew as fast as I could. I tried to hide. I was so frightened. I couldn't even make myself move. What if I bumped into another bee? I couldn't even stand to think about what might happen if I did. I realized I had to move. I had to find something to eat. Shaking with fear, I tiptoed out into the open. Oddly enough, it was at this very moment when deciding to start sucking up some of this scrumptious honey that Gary started to, I don't know, appreciate being a bee a little bit. Like, he never liked honey before. In fact, earlier in the book, when his mom offers to make him a peanut butter and jelly sandwich but realizes like they're out of jam, she offers to substitute the jam for something else and brings up honey as an example. But this grosses Gary out and he doesn't end up having a sandwich. What's so funny about this to me is, okay, I finally have an excuse to share this. Fun fact about me: I've never had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
I know, put the pitchforks down.
I really loved peanut butter as a kid. Like, I'd eat it straight from the jar. But it's the jam that like made me avoid these sandwiches at all costs, because I absolutely hate, I still feel this way, the way that artificial grape tastes like. So that's just what I imagined it would taste like. I don't know, okay? I was a lot more picky as a kid. Artificial grape tastes like medicine to me. And if you disagree, good. You can have it. I don't want artificial grape. You can have it all to yourself. Enjoy. But now as an adult, I'm not like opposed to trying it or anything. I'm just like not really drawn to that combination, you know? Mostly because I have to be craving peanut butter to eat it, or else it's just kind of gross to me now. I think it's because I ate it so much, like literally from the jar with a spoon. Of course I'm sick of it now. So if I'm not like craving it, it is a little gross to me. I also think peanut butter is like very rich tasting, and I think it's just too overpowering sometimes. But you know what I did like as a kid? Honey. And not just any honey. Like, do you guys remember those honey sticks? Because every time we'd go to, I think it was Sprouts, when I was a kid, I'd see those like near the checkout, and on a number of occasions I convinced my mom to buy them for me. And like Sprouts, we wouldn't go there like every single time we went grocery shopping. It'd be like every few months we'd go there like once or twice. And so it was like a little treat. Like, it was like a little reward for having to go to the store, which was really boring. And if you're wondering, I didn't spread the honey on anything, okay? I sucked it straight out of the tube. I loved it. It hit different, okay? You had to experience it. Now back to the bees, okay? The next day, Gary is confronted by some more angry bees, but this time it's like multiple. But after like cornering him, they get distracted by a dancing bee in the center of the hive floor. I haven't mentioned this, but throughout the book, Gary mentions this book he used to have as a kid called called Big Book of Bees, which was all about bees. A little strange for someone to have who's so scared of bees, but also he mentions he's lived next door to this neighbor his whole life. So maybe his parents got him the book due to his curiosity of like always, you know, having bees around, I guess. Like not directly, obviously, but like through the fence, you could hear them. But my point is, he remembers from that book, hey, bees send out scouts to find their food. And the dancing is actually a signal of where to get it. So when he put that together, he realized this could be his way out of the hive. And he knew he looked just like the other bees lined up to escape through a tiny hole in a far upper corner of the hive. Only, as Gary explained, the difference is he wouldn't willingly return. But how would anyone know that? Unfortunately for Gary though, when he arrives at this like hole he'd seen in the screen, when he was in his own like human body, it had been like patched up. So he wasn't in the hive, he wasn't out just yet. He was in this weird middle ground area, like when he first got put inside the contraption, I guess. And at this point, he's just scrambling to find another way out because clearly the rest of the bees made it out. So there had to be another exit nearby. Suddenly though, the door between the beekeeping like area and the garage opened, and looking down at him was Andretti. He was confused because Gary wasn't doing his job and he was simply lying around on top of the hive. He started to ask himself, why isn't he in there busy making me some honey? Is he sick? This got Gary worried because if this is what he did with healthy bees, what would he do with a sick bee? Just as his hand was actually coming toward Gary to like wrap his fingers around him, I guess, he shot up in the air and clung onto the screen. Luckily, at that moment, he did spot another exit, or he spotted the bees coming back in, so he waited for all of them to come back inside, but in the end, Gary finally escaped. After this point, Gary makes his way back into his house because even though nobody can hear him, or knows it's him for that matter, it's definitely comforting to be in a familiar environment and like know he's safe by some means, as long as he doesn't make himself known. But he does do this. He attempts to make his presence known, and he does. And this almost gets him killed by his sister, who has a record. No, not a record. Who has a reputation. There, that was the word I was looking for killing bugs with the fly swatter. She doesn't miss, but I guess she does this time. He's able to escape, and he ends up going upstairs to his own room, where Dirk, aka Gary, is sleeping still. So Gary tries to wake him up to get his attention with no avail. After failing miserably at this point, he realizes the computer is actually still on, so he could attempt to type out a message for someone to read, and then they would know, like, oh my god, he's this bee. So he does, and right as he's finishing up the message, Gary wakes up, or Dirk. The message that Gary was able to type reads, I am not bee, I am Gary, hello me. However, being that he's half asleep, he's really just confused that the computer is still on and shuts it off before leaving the room. Gary decides to follow himself and discovers how his life has really drastically changed, or improved actually, since Dirk has taken over his body. He crossed the yard and opened our garage door. Then he went inside and brought out my old skateboard. I hadn't used that skateboard in at least 2 years. My uncle had given it to me for my 10th birthday. I almost broke my leg trying to ride it. After that, I put it away and refused to touch it again. Don't get on that thing, I yelled at Gary. Gary, it's dangerous. You might hurt my body, and I want it back in one piece. Of course, Gary didn't even notice me. Instead, he carried the skateboard out to the front of the house and put it on the ground. A short while later, Caitlin and Judy walked up the sidewalk. I waited for them to start giggling and making fun of the new me. Hi, Gary, Caitlin said. She brushed some curly hair off her forehead and smiled. Are we late for our skateboarding lesson? Yeah, that's right. The same Caitlin and Judy from earlier when he wrecked his bike, almost got hit by a car, were now getting skateboarding lessons from Gary. And it's not just them either. Gary ends up following the three of them to the park, and there's more kids wanting to take skateboarding lessons from him. This is so difficult for him to grasp, because essentially for someone who's used to dealing with such cruelty from his peers, this was like watching his dream life play out in front of him. Only he wasn't the one experiencing it. He was a bee. He realized that Dirk wasn't going to be of any help in regards to fixing things, getting him out of this body. That left Miss Carmen as, his only hope to fix things. So off he went on his journey back to the person-to-person vacation building. It wasn't a long journey, and luckily for Gary, the mail was conveniently being delivered when he got there. So he was able to sneak inside without having to necessarily open the door or find an open window, which would be kind of unlikely unlikely, I assume, from the way like the building is described. Once inside the building, he actually began to struggle to get Miss Carmen's attention, but before that, things were off to a rough start with Gary smacking directly into the glass that separated him from Miss Carmen the last time he'd come in the office inquiring about this service in the first place. Even when being given like the questionnaire, they never actually met face to face. There instead was a little slot that Gary received his paperwork from. So that's what he realized he could use to, you know, make his way behind the glass. Usually that would be way too small of a space for, you know, something to get through. But because he's a bee, he could actually easily go through there. The first thing he does when getting behind, you know, the other side of the glass is he tries to get Ms. Carmen's attention, but quickly remembers she'll never be able to hear him. He's too small. However, unlike every other place he's tried to get people's attention, this office had something that could benefit Gary. Remember how because of the glass, Miss Carmen spoke to Gary from the other side using a speaker? Well, that's how Gary realized he could actually get her attention. And it works. She can actually hear him. Miss Carmen! Her eyes opened wide. Her mouth dropped open in confusion. She stared into the waiting room, searching for the person speaking. "It's Gary Lutz," I called out. "I'm down here on your microphone." Miss Carmen stared down at the microphone. Then her eyes narrowed in fear. What's going on? Who's doing this? Is this a joke? "No," I cried out. "It's no joke at all. It's really me, Gary Lutz." But, she stammered, but no other words came out. "What's the joke? How are you doing that?" Her voice was so loud. The sound waves nearly blasted me off the microphone. "You don't have to yell," I cried. "I can hear you." "I don't believe this," she exclaimed in a trembling voice. She stared down at me. "It's all your fault," I shouted angrily. "You messed up the transfer operation. When you made the switch, one of my neighbor's bees must have gotten into the machine. So instead of putting me into Dirk Davis's body, you put me into a bee." Miss Carmen blinked, then slapped her forehead. "Well, that explains it," she cried. It turns out Dirk Davis's body had been acting pretty weird, and I guess she just didn't question it. It wasn't like she didn't know there were bees there necessarily, because right before the, you know, transformation happened, Gary was freaking out because like they kept flying past him, and she was telling him to be still, or else she wouldn't be able to complete the transformation. After this interaction, he actually goes to see like Dirk, and this guy is literally eating pollen like a bee and can't speak any English. He's only saying hum, or I don't know if he says buzz, but he definitely says hum. With that context, I kind of spoiled the fact that, yeah, Miss Carmen isn't much help. See, normally she'd just transfer him back, but apparently Dirk loves being Gary. So essentially, she breaks this news to Gary, that Dirk is refusing to give up his body and wants to keep it forever. Which catches Gary completely off guard, and honestly me too, because what do you mean he can do that? This feels illegal somehow. I don't think these kids signed any contracts prior to, you know, doing this, but surely when you claim for a week, you should stick to just a week, like you claimed? Unless both parties are like in favor of keeping things more permanent going forward or doing it for a longer period of time. But I will say, Miss Carmen does feel really bad though, and seems really panicked about the whole thing because she's never had something like this happen before. But at the same time, she also says this, but he can't do that, can he? "It is very upsetting," she replied, biting her lower lip. "It wasn't what he said in our original agreement, but if he refuses to get out of your body and your life, there's really nothing I can do." Miss Carmen gazed down at me sympathetically. "I'm so sorry about this, Gary," she said softly. "I guess I'll just have to be more careful in the future." "What about my future? What am I supposed to do now?" I wailed. Miss Carmen shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe you could go back and wait in the hive?"
I hate that I laughed. I hate that I laughed. But that reply was so unserious.
Who wants to go back to the hive? The hive sounded horrifying. Even like just thinking about having that experience, I just don't think that sounds comforting at all. I don't think that sounds like enjoyable. Yeah, I don't know. I can't even make a B-movie joke because this book was actually published in 1994, but in my mind, I was just like, does she think this shit is like the B-movie? Every day I'm truly just so thankful to be Gen Z. Because what do you mean there was a time where people just existed without true cinema like the B-movie? Gen Z wouldn't survive without phones like we did. I beg to differ. I actually think it's the media I consumed as a child that I wouldn't survive without. Anyway, Gary decides to confront Dirk, like the one in his body, not the bee in Dirk's body. He already did that right before he goes to confront the Dirk that's in his body. But here comes the real plot twist of it all. The whole time it turns out that Dirk could hear Gary. He could hear other bugs too, he mentions, but I guess never put two and two together? Or maybe he just did and didn't care because life was so good. Enough chit-chat, I told him. When do you plan to get out of my body? Never, he replied. He picked up his comic book and started reading again. I like your body. I can't understand why you gave it up to become a bee. That wasn't my idea, I screamed. You've got a good life here, he continued. I mean, you have great parents, Chrissy is an okay sister, and Claus is an awesome cat. Too bad you didn't know all that when you were in your body, which is now my body. I get what Dirk is trying to get at here. I really liked how he started it with like, you've got a great life here. But this is worded like Gary was just some ungrateful kid when he was dead ass never given a break. I mean, he was literally getting beat up. Dirk knows this too because on the way to confront Dirk, Gary actually spotted him running into the same three bullies, only now they are scared of Gary because I guess he gave them a taste of their own medicine. By all means, his family definitely wasn't abusive, but they still weren't like the kindest to him over the course of this book when he was already, going through a lot, But learning all this information kind of makes things really set in for Gary, as if being a bee wasn't already hard enough. He remembered another fact from his childhood book, which is the lifespan of a bee. Typically the worker and drone bees died off in the fall, and since it was nearly August, this meant that he wouldn't live much longer. Not much longer than another month or two. Feeling defeated, Gary flew away, well in defeat. He was reminiscing about his old life very much. Like, it wasn't even that good, but like he came to appreciate it now with the circumstances at hand. Suddenly, he heard a buzz and another bee had approached him by this like blossom he was peering over outside. Soon it was two bees. And similar to what happened in the hive with the bees like cornering him, this time it kind of gave him an idea. He decided to squirm away from all these bees because like they just kept coming and coming and kind of swarming him. And as he did so and, flew away, he buzzed as loud as he could, which made them all follow him around. Then he flew back to his bedroom. This made Gary agitated because although he wasn't scared of bees, who wants a horde of bees in their room, Gary decided this wasn't enough and actually went back to the hive to attract those bees too, which also worked. And although he now had all these bees in his room, Dirk's stance did not change. He wanted to keep Gary's life and his body, and he actually relatively was unbothered despite being, again, inconvenienced. The bees naturally began to lose interest, leaving Gary at kind of a standstill, and he felt at this point there was only one thing left to do, and he clearly had nothing left to lose. He did the one thing he was dreading the most. He stung Dirk, or he stung himself. If you don't know bees, when they sting someone, they die. If you've seen the Bee Movie, I think you would know this.
I'm sorry, I can't stop mentioning the Bee Movie. I love the Bee Movie!
So, knowing this fact, he had been avoiding stinging anyone, even though he could have easily stung his beekeeper neighbor earlier and was absolutely tempted to because this guy kind of sucks, but he held off. But being so frustrated in this moment, he truly was not thinking, and by the time he realized what he had done, it was too late. I felt the strength drain from me, weaker and weaker. What have I done? I asked myself. I gave up my life for the chance to sting Dirk Davis. Why was I such a jerk? I struggled to keep my wings moving, struggled to stay in the air. I knew I was doomed. I wanted to stay alive as long as I could. Maybe, I thought, as I felt my strength fading, maybe I'll have a chance to tell my family goodbye. Mom, Dad, Chrissy, I buzzed faintly. Where are you? It was hard to breathe. I felt so tired, so weak. I floated out the window and sank to the grass below. I thought I recognized the shape of the old maple tree, where I used to read books and spy on Andretti, but my sight was so bad it was hard to be sure about anything. The whole world swirled into a gray shadow. I could no longer hold up my head. The gray shadows grew darker and darker until the world simply had completely faded from view. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Psych! You thought wrong. After this, Gary comes back to consciousness under the same maple tree and immediately goes to fly, but is pleased to realize he is in fact back in his body. He is Gary again! This book actually ends on a relatively good note, with Gary like reflecting on his experience as a bee a month after this all had went down and happened. He says that things have been so much better ever since the experience, and it really changed his life for the better overall. Firstly, it made him appreciate his family for the first time in his life. His words, not mine. Secondly, he's not scared of bees anymore, and not scared of a lot of the other things I mentioned he was afraid of at the beginning of the story. That includes, you know, those bullies who used to beat him up. Thanks to Dirk's time spent as Gary, they've finally left him alone. Lastly, overall as a person, Gary just acknowledges that he's different, not in a negative way. He's a lot better at sports and biking now. He's even been able to retain those skateboarding skills that people were so impressed with, and he still gives skateboarding lessons too, and is seemingly making friends through this, you know, shared interest. The other day, he even ran into the myth, the man, the legend himself, Dirk Davis. He actually turned out to be super nice and was apologetic towards Gary about hogging his body the way he did. In the end, he really got the karma he deserved anyway, because the bee in his body absolutely flunked that, you know, math test he was so concerned about. But as you can tell, this whole experience actually made them become friends, which is really cool. So it's safe to say that Gary is officially free from the shackles that were extreme loneliness. Now, that is it for this video. Serious this time. Thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know your thoughts on this book in the comments, and if you read it as a kid, I'm very curious. If you guys want another Goosebumps video in the future, make sure to suggest what book next in the comments. This definitely got me sort of hooked, and I fear I need to reread more of these stories if they are all as unhinged as this one was. If you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend my last video, which the algorithm hasn't picked up yet due to the copyright issues I experienced with it. But the topic is also RL Stine related, so if you were into this, I think you would really like it. As always, huge shout out to my Patreon members. I appreciate you guys so much. Next week, I'll be filming some bonus content for y'all, watching some Haunting Hour episodes I haven't covered on the channel, and we don't have to worry about copyright on there, which is really awesome. If you know, you know. The Haunting Hour is very strict on YouTube. It is very much a struggle with that, what I've had to deal with my last video. I was surprised that video even got unblocked, to be honest. I feel really grateful because seriously, I was not gonna re-edit it again. I distorted the footage so much, I don't even know how anything was detected. But otherwise, I'll be back on YouTube with my next video at the beginning of November. I haven't figured out the topic yet, but the sisters video will 100% be the second video I've planned in November. I don't want to do 2 book videos in a row because that's just like a lot of work. I don't want to burn myself out. You know, uploading 2 weeks in a row was already difficult, but I did it! Be proud. But yeah, the sisters video has been super requested. I would have done it this month if it was in October. I wanted to do some special videos, so it will be coming in November, and I'm so excited to reread the book. Also, my collab with Athena will be coming out next month on her channel. My part is already up, obviously, if you didn't know, but I'll be included in her video still, so look forward to that. So you can look forward to that. But yeah, with that, happy Halloween, or happy belated Halloween, happy early Halloween, and I will see you guys in November.